pod słońcem. Rasti u jaslama dječjim, rasti i cvjetaj zemljo radnih ljudi. I neka mir nad tvojim ljudima vlada, mir tvojim lađama na pučini i tvome danu što se vedar budi. Rasti sretna da svi narodi vide, sa strana svih, sa juga i sjevera, kako se rađa i kako se voli, kako se brani zemlja proletera. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Sreći u vodi i u zraku, u pjesmi strojeva i u sjaju žita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode, pod rukom partije i pod srcem Tita. Rasti i cvjetaj pod zvijezdom slobode,
Greetings, everybody, and welcome. It is the 20th of June, 2024, and you join me today for another live stream. We are looking at the visit of Russian President Vladimir Putin to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, and subsequently, of course, his visits to Vietnam as well, and related issues therein. So, going to be looking at that. Putin said and wrote a number of interesting things, particularly over the visit to the DPRK, the visit to Vietnam is significant, but of course, Putin's been to Vietnam on slightly more times. I believe he's had at least 6 visits to Vietnam since he first became president in 2000, or really 1999. And the visit to Pyongyang, though, was only his second, though, of course, it was, I believe, the first place he visited after he became president officially for the first time in 2000, so 24 years ago. So that's an interesting detail. And, of course, the relationship between the DPRK and the Russian Federation is one which has changed over time and now is, shall we say, moving back into much more positive territory. Though, of course, they have always retained a defense relationship, even when the Russians and the Chinese were, in my view, making a disastrous decision to try and appease US imperialism by going along with the sanctions regime against the DPRK. But we can get to that later on. So it is the visits into the DPRK to which we will be turning first. Now, this was probably quite a while in the making. Of course, nothing ever just comes out of thin air. Diplomats and state officials work on these things for a number of years. Now, Putin, before going to both the DPRK and Vietnam, wrote articles for the relevant party newspapers. So for the newspaper of the Communist Party of Vietnam and for the newspaper of the Workers' Party of Korea. A Korean paper is called Rodong Sinmun. I've probably mangled that name, but that's what it's called. So the article that Putin wrote here contained a lot of very interesting details, and of course, drawing from the extensive history of Soviet-Korean relations. He mentions in the article, which you can find on the website of the Russian presidency, depending upon which browser you use and seemingly which time of the day, it's either relatively easy or nearly impossible to get on there. So I always use a VPN, which allows me to pretend that I'm in Russia. So Putin starts off the article by mentioning quite extensively the role played by the Red Army, the Soviet Red Army, fighting alongside the Korean national liberation movement against Japanese militarism. Because, of course, this is exactly what happened. Korea, as you'll know if you listened to the 2 interviews we've done previously with Dr. Dermot Hudson of the Korean Friendship Association, Korea, all of Korea, the Korean Peninsula, was occupied by Japanese imperialism between the period of around about 1904 to 05 all the way through to 1945. And that 40-year period in which Korea was wholly occupied by Japanese imperialism was one of a seemingly unending parade of barbarities and cruelties that are every bit as worthy as inclusion in the pantheon of the crimes of imperialism as anything that was committed by the Nazis themselves, the British, the French, the Spanish, or any other European colonial power. Japanese militarism based itself very much on European colonialism, and so that it ended up committing all of the same crimes should not exactly be a surprise. But this was a very long and very bitter struggle that the Korean people had to wage for their freedom. And it should be noted that many of those who the US was to later employ in the construction of the state of that's known as South Korea or the Republic of Korea, or in reality occupied Korea, many of the people employed by the US in constructing that state had previously been implicated in the Japanese colonial administration. So the various characters who ended up in the South Korean government had had business relationships with the Japanese, had even run various things for the occupation authorities. At the same time, of course, the Japanese were committing hideous crimes against the Korean workers and peasants. They were carrying out Nazi-style biological experiments on human beings. They were doing conducting all kinds of massacres and collective punishment that would be worthy of Israel today. And yet, of course, there is always a comprador layer that will gladly collaborate with any occupying authority, even to the stage of selling out the people who are being subjected to mass repressions and even mass murder. So there's a layer in the Korean bourgeois and the landlord class that sold out to the Japanese, and there's a layer that sold out later to the United States, and happily did so. But of course, the war that was waged by Kim Il-sung and the National Liberation Forces was at least partially successful, and would have been wholly successful were it not for the active intervention of US imperialism. Of course, the Soviet troops that went there in 1945 that threw out the Japanese from the north of the Korean Peninsula. Soviet troops stayed for a while and planned to depart when their job had been completed. The US troops that rocked up there, originally it was also the British, never left. They stayed there to secure the rule of the South Korean government, which was, of course, was and is based on the power of the comprador bourgeoisie and the Korean landlords. And the assistance rendered to the DPRK by the Soviet Union and also, of course, revolutionary China helped them hang on in that war, where US imperialism really did throw everything at winning the Korean War and was unable to. Ultimately, it was not a complete defeat because they got to hang on to South Korea, but a humbling of US imperialism. Only 5 years after the conclusion of World War II, the US, of course, involved itself, as all imperialist powers do, in a brutish war trying to suppress a national liberation movement that ended up killing 3 million Koreans. And if you dive into the history, both immediately before the war broke out and afterwards, you'll see what I mean in terms of the fascist style regime they set up in the South, the mass repression that it engaged in, the acts of mass murder that it engaged in. This is what South Korea is built on. So whenever it's always the same. Whenever there's any discussion of a socialist government in the Western press, it's always non-specific and hysterical screams about repression, one-party rule, totalitarianism. Everybody has to have the same haircut. Everybody has to wear the same outfit as Kim Jong-un any time of the day. Of course, none of this is true. The reality is that the genuine, if we're going to talk about authoritarianism, comes not in the north but in the south, just as it always has done. The genuinely, if you want to talk about totalitarianism, which I think is a bit of a useless concept in reality, but let's go with the old Hannah Arendt idea for a moment. Well, that always has much more applied to the south, which is having a long-term devastating impact in terms of the destruction of Korean culture, because it's an occupied nation. Nobody could ever accuse the DPRK of being an occupied nation. And nobody could ever accuse the DPRK of not being a distinctively Korean nation. The occupied South has, of course, lost its culture, become subject to all manner of degeneration, and the population there is worked to death and is miserable, and hence why the birth rate is so catastrophically low, far below now replacement rates. So South Korea, occupied Korea, worse Korea, is being destroyed, and it's being destroyed ultimately by the US occupation. So going back to the article by Putin, he begins by mentioning the assistance rendered by the Red Army, and of course there's a monument which Putin actually visited to pay his respects to the fallen Red Army soldiers who died in the liberation of what's now the DPRK from Japanese imperialism. So he also mentioned quite correctly the assistance rendered by the Soviet Union in the rebuilding of the DPRK after the war. And of course, even though the DPRK didn't choose a side in the Sino-Soviet split, they still retained extensive economic relations with the USSR. However, Kim Il-sung and the others in that period of the DPRK leadership did insist that despite the close relationship, economically speaking, with the Soviet Union, that the DPRK had to develop as much self-reliance in terms of agriculture and industry as possible. And it was only really that insistence upon self-reliance that managed to, that aided them significantly in getting through the very difficult period when they lost their primary trading partner when the Soviet Union dissolved. And of course, Yeltsin and his clique tried to, actively destroy any relationship that had existed with a still existing socialist state. And again, go back and visit the interviews that we did with Dermot Hudson when he was talking about the what's called the arduous march period in the 1990s. So Putin continues and talks about the relationship between the two countries and its and how it's developed over time. And he mentioned how appreciative he is, and the Russian government is, of the DPRK's strong support for the special military operation in Ukraine. And now we get to some very interesting parts, which I'm going to read out in full because I think it's worth emphasizing these. I am going to be putting the English language translation of the two articles Putin's written on the Marx Engels Lenin Institute website, so you can find the full text on there later today. So Putin goes and moves on to talk about the role of US imperialism. And he says the following: the United States of America is trying its best to impose on the world a so-called rules-based order, which in essence is nothing more than a global neo-colonial dictatorship based on double standards. Countries that do not agree with this approach and pursue independent policies are faced with increasingly severe external pressures. The US leadership views such a natural and legitimate desire for independence and autonomy as a threat to its dominance in the world. The United States and its satellites openly declare that their goal is to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. They are doing everything to prolong and further inflame the conflict in Ukraine, which they themselves provoked by supporting and organizing an armed coup in Kiev in 2014 and then the war in Donbass. At the same time, all these years they have time and again rejected our attempts to peacefully resolve the situation. Russia has been and will be open to equal dialogue on all the most complex issues. I spoke about this again recently during a meeting with Russian diplomats in Moscow. At the same time, on the contrary, our opponents continue to supply the neo-Nazi Kiev regime with money, weapons, and intelligence data, allowing and actually encouraging the use of modern Western weapons and equipment to strike Russian territory, and most often, for obviously harmful purposes, they are threatening to send their military contingents to Ukraine. At the same time, they are trying to exhaust our economy with ever new sanctions and provoke an increase in socio-political tension within the country. So, he goes on to say how this has, of course, all failed, which it has so far. So I thought that this was, of course, an interesting choice in language. Now, bear in mind, of course, Putin is writing specifically for the DPRK audience, so we'll use the language that he thinks is going to resonate there. But it is, in essence, the same message that he goes everywhere with. And I found that his use of the term global neo-colonial dictatorship to be an accurate one, because that is a very accurate way to describe the way that the last 30 years have gone, and the way that the US imperialists have tried to construct the post-Cold War era. If we go back and we examine the work of the great Kwame Nkrumah, when he's defining neo-colonialism, it is exactly the relationship that the US has tried to build with, well, all countries around the world, particularly subordinated ones, since the early 1990s. And it is a global neo-colonial dictatorship. Putin is exactly right about that. Anybody who does not accept the unfettered movement of US capital into its markets and the destruction and asset stripping of its industry, the reduction of most countries who have any amount of natural resources into either a pool of reserve labor or just to be a site of raw resource extraction or a site of hyper exploitation for outsourced or offshore work, then if they do not accept those terms without hesitation, then they are subjected to either a sanctions regime or, in some cases, direct military intervention, good old-fashioned, what we used to call in Britain, gunboat diplomacy. And I think that this is one of the reasons why what the Russian government says about the intentions of the United States and its allies and vassals goes down well with countries in what is referred to these days as the global south, or it used to be called the third world, or the global majority is probably the most accurate way to term it. The reason why when Putin says these things he finds an audience is because it's undeniably true. Now, what I'm going to do, inspired partially by this, is I'm going to go back and read again Nkrumah's work on neocolonialism, because I think it's fascinating. He's one of the great Marxist thinkers of the 20th century, particularly of the later 20th century. He really adds more to the theories of Lenin, Stalin, and Mao. I think his work needs to be highlighted in the West much more than it has been. So I'm going to go back and look at Nkrumah's work on neocolonialism, because I think by using this and using the term that Putin has used there, we can have a really carry out an interesting examination of the history of the last 30 years. If we look at it as an attempt at a global neocolonialism, I think this is a very useful way of terming it. So using Nkrumah's work to explore this further is going to be a useful line of inquiry. So, a very interesting in the way that Putin talks about that. And he goes on to talk about how what he and the Russian government value in terms of the friendship with the DPRK. So, next quote reads as follows. It is gratifying that our Korean friends, despite many years of economic pressure, provocations, blackmail, and military threats from the United States, are equally effective in defending their interests. We see with what strength, dignity, and courage the people of the DPRK are fighting for their freedom, sovereignty, and national traditions, achieving colossal results, real breakthroughs in strengthening the defense and technological, scientific, and industrial power of the country. At the same time, the country's leadership, led by Comrade Kim Jong-un, has repeatedly expressed a desire to resolve all existing differences peacefully. However, Washington, refusing to implement previously reached agreements, continuously puts forward new, increasingly stringent and obviously unacceptable demands. Russia has always supported, well, that's dubious, and will continue to support the DPRK and the heroic Korean people in their opposition to the insidious, dangerous, and aggressive enemy in their struggle for independence, identity, and the right to choose their own path of development. So just a minor point, well, not minor, but I would contest this bit, which is that Russia has always supported and will continue to support the DPRK. They did to an extent. I mean, if you recall 20 years ago, when good old George W. Bush, remember him, declared that the DPRK was part of the axis of evil, if you remember that speech, courtesy of a certain Canadian, I don't know if he's a former Trotskyite, but he certainly acts like one, a certain David Frum. It was his phrase, the axis of evil. And the DPRK was thrown in there with Iran and Iraq. Now, of course, it's just made up bullshit, but the DPRK does, of course, have a relationship with Iran, and they've had it since at least the Iranian Revolution in 1980. DPRK took the side of Iran during the Iran-Iraq war. And they've had a relationship ever since then, but they had very little to do with Iraq under Saddam Hussein. In fact, they consistently sided with Iran all the way through that period of conflict in the 1980s, as I just said. So it was always a very strange combination of things. It looked like it was always based on basically what their priorities for regime change wars were 20 years ago. So back then, of course, they did Iraq, which the Russians did vote against at the UN Security Council, as did the Chinese, but it was the French back then that were fronting up that opposition for their own reasons and for their own interests. But there was always rumors that the Russian government was still collaborating with the Bush administration behind the scenes in terms of giving technical specifications about Soviet-made equipment to the Americans prior to the invasion. Now, that wouldn't surprise me. And here we get on to, what is the reasoning behind the actions of the Russian government in terms of its position then and its position now. Its position back then was still essentially based on a balance of forces inside the Russian political system that favored, shall we say, subservience to the West. As has been noted recently by Zyuganov of the KPRF in the recent analysis delivered to the plenum of the KPRF Central Committee, the Bonapartist system that was built in the Russian Federation following the crisis and near collapse of the Russian state in the late 1990s was brought about by that crisis, but was based on a balance of forces that had within it open comprador elements, and they were quite strongly represented in that early period. You also had various forms of nationalist elements in there as well. So in that early Putin period, I mean, Putin himself is obviously the key man in this, but where he is, I don't think he very rarely allows he can't really allow his personal preferences to direct state affairs. Whatever he does, obviously he has a strong voice in making decisions, but it does reflect a certain consensus within the Russian system based on a balance of forces inside that system. So in the early years, the reason why you still have Putin going to Germany and giving a speech in German to the Reichstag about the great relationship between Russia and Germany, that is, of course, partially his preference due to the fact that he was well disposed towards Germany, having spent a number of years in East Germany, and still speaks fondly of that time. The reason why he was building a relationship with old George W. Bush was because this was the position favored by the balance of forces within the Russian system at the time, and the way the system was moving at that time was towards trying to build some kind of permanent and stable relationship with U.S. imperialism, and also with the Europeans, that they could continue, of course, to sell large amounts of gas and oil into the European market and into the American market. But principally, it was into the European market that the Russians were interested in. And so they had to, and if they were pursuing that, they pursued a rapprochement with the US to the point where the Russians complained, but generally looked the other way when it came to the Baltic states joining NATO, when it came to the NATO expansion into the east and swallowing up the old Warsaw Pact, and the incredibly rabid anti-communist and anti-Russian governments that dwelt therein, especially in Poland. So they swallowed all of that. Now, eventually, though, things do start to change, as we've covered extensively on this program before. And they change because essentially the line that's being pushed by the pro-US comprador element in Russia gets discredited. And it gets discredited by the actions of the US imperialists themselves. Every time Putin goes over there, and he's just talked about this quite extensively over the last 6 or 7 years, often sometimes to English language interviewers, but more often than not in speeches that he gives. And he talks about, well, every time that he thought he'd reached some sort of arrangement with either George W. Bush or Barack Obama, then he found that arrangement or agreement, it turned into mist. It evaporated as soon as the pen had been put to paper. Why was that? Because, again, Putin analyzes this himself quite accurately. He says, well, it doesn't really matter who the US president is, because the US isn't run by the president. The US is run by a machine. It is the machinery of imperialism. Now, you can call it the permanent state, the deep state, the bureaucracy, whatever it is. But Putin, of course, who knows this very well, he's been around 25 years now dealing with the US. He knows that essentially that there's a machine there which any given president, even one as reactionary as George W. Bush, or openly reactionary as George W. Bush, only has limited control over, if any at all. And so he understands the essence of the American system now. And what happens with the line taken by the Russian government with regard to a country like the DPRK is that the relations with the DPRK, they've always been a little bit more extensive than the Russians publicly admitted to, I think. One area where that old reactionary anti-communist nutjob Colonel McGregor is correct is that I think the Korean nuclear deterrent program, Korean nuclear missile program, did probably receive some assistance from the Russians early on in its creation, and that was kind of done under the table. And as to the Russians and the Chinese agreeing to the sanctions on the DPRK, again, this was something which I agree with the point of view expressed by Alexander Mercouris on this. It was principally, this was a plan that was agreed to by the Chinese leadership, both in the periods under Yang Zemin and Hu Jintao, and more recently as well. Because again, it's not just the decision made by the Chinese president. It's a decision which reflects the consensus opinion inside the Chinese party. And the consensus opinion back then, prior to around about 2013 to 14, I think. So it coincides broadly with the changes that bring about the Xi Jinping leadership. Prior to that, there'd been a line that was more favorable to keeping open relations with the United States, even at the cost of slapping sanctions on the DPRK. Even though, of course, I don't think that the US was ever really in with a chance of invading the DPRK. I think the Chinese would still have honored their defense agreements with the DPRK because they don't want to have a US colony sat right across the border from them. That would not be something that they would want to see, even in the earlier period where the pro-US, more comprador element was stronger in the CPC. So the changes in Russian policy with regard to the DPRK it's a case of, first of all, what was being done under the table a lot of the time in terms of covert support to the DPRK is now coming out into the open. And also, and this is the positive thing, now the Russians are more prepared to, and the Chinese are more prepared to openly just tell the US to do one. Not in so many words, but essentially that's what Putin is saying when we come to his statements about military assistance to the DPRK later. He's more specific about the Russian government's motivations for coming out into the open and doing this. They're now prepared to basically admit and embrace the fact that any attempt to build a relationship with the US imperialists has just failed. They never can. They've finally, well, I should say that those in the Russian system who always knew this, because there's always been people in the Russian government, in the Putin-led system, who always knew that an agreement with the US that lasted more than about 5 seconds was impossible. What needed to happen was that those elements, the Yeltsin-type elements, the liberals who were strong in the early years of the Putin presidency, they needed to be discredited and their line needed to be discredited. And God bless George W. Bush, Barack Obama, Joe Biden, Donald Trump. they thoroughly discredited Russian liberalism, even more than it had been discredited already. So those who favor redeveloping a more extensive economic and military relationship with the DPRK, those factions inside the Russian system are now winning out. And of course, as part of that pressure does, of course, come from the KPRF. Putin was emphasizing recently at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum how strong the KPRF were inside the Russian political system, because he suddenly found that most of his allies in the world now are either left-leaning anti-colonial nationalists or out-and-out communist or socialist governments. The Russians are discovering bit by bit that that memes aren't reality. By that I mean that the idea of a based European right-wing nationalist opposition to the US simply doesn't exist, which is what a lot of the Russians, I think including people like Medvedev, were hoping for. They were hoping for like based right-wingers to take over the European governments and then declare partnerships based on traditional values with the Russians. And of course, all of this has evaporated into steam because again, you can't take anything like a European or a British right-winger says seriously, because all of these people are just expressions of what at the moment are minority points of view within the ruling class, but they're still points of view from the ruling class, and therefore they will fall into line when the ruling class cracks the whip, as they always do. So interesting realizations being made within the Russian government, and of course they went on to sign a comprehensive partnership agreement. Some interesting things that came out of the press conference between Putin and Kim Jong-un and the representatives of the Korean and Russian media. I wanted just to read a couple of quotes from this. Kim Jong-un opening up the press conference said this: at this moment, when the whole world with rapt attention turns its gaze to Pyongyang, where the mission of friendship from Russia has arrived, I stand with Russian comrades, the most honest friends and comrades in this solemn hall, and this gives me a deep feeling. The President of the Russian Federation, Comrade Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and I have just signed an agreement on a comprehensive strategic partnership between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Russian Federation, which will forever shine in the history of the development of friendly relations between the Democratic People's Republic of Korea and the Russian Federation. I found it quite interesting that Kim Jong-un refers to Putin as Comrade Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, or Comrade President Putin, all the way through this. And Putin repays the compliment. Again, it's just using the terminology of the state you're in. But I find it rather amusing, because knowing how many, maybe not inside the Russian population, but how many rabid anti-communists there still are inside the Russian government, I wonder how that particular layer reacted to this. So we'll get to Putin's comments, who begins by addressing Kim Jong-un as Dear Comrade Chairman. He makes, again, he reiterates some points that he made in the article, but we get to the meat of the issue when he's talking about trade relations. So trade between the DPRK and Russia has increased by 54% over the first 5 months of 2024. Now, bear in mind, that's 54% of official trade, which wasn't very much. So it's a big step up, but it's a big step up from almost nothing. So bear that in mind when we're talking about this. So he also talks about there being important industrial partnerships being built, that they're going to modernize the Kasan-Rajian Railway, and that's going to be done by the Russian Railways, a state-directed corporation in the manner of many corporations inside Russia at the moment. So they also have built or are extending a port in Russia that's going to deal with shipments directly from the DPRK. So they're clearly building up the infrastructure to increase trade there, which is, of course, a positive thing for the DPRK. I should, and I always will, mention in this that the reason the DPRK survived, and again, can't be emphasized enough, is partially down to the fact that they did have this strong philosophy and practice of self-reliance, industrial and agricultural self-reliance. But it's also the fact that Kim Il-sung and his successors and the WPK, Workers' Party of Korea leadership, are and have been very effective practitioners of the mass line. And they are possibly, again, I would need to do more research on this to give a definitive view, but possibly the most effective practitioners of it that the last century has seen, more so than the Chinese themselves, arguably. And it is only because they have that incredibly close relationship and with the masses who are permanently engaged and active in the government of the country. It's only that, really, that and the philosophies of self-reliance, but it's the strength of the relationship with the masses and the constant activity of the masses that has enabled the DPRK to survive this long. And if they didn't have that, a very close relationship with a continuously active working class that is participating within directly within the governance of the nation, then the DPRK wouldn't have survived. So always has those points always have to be emphasized. So to move on to some other interesting things that Putin said here, right? He goes on, having talked about the development of economic relations between the two countries and the aspiration to extend those very quickly. He talks about the sanctions regime of US imperialism further. So I'll read a further quote here. Despite external pressure, our countries are successfully developing on a sovereign and independent basis and have provided each other with full support as true friends and good neighbors. We will also continue to oppose the very practice of sanctions strangulation as a tool that the West is accustomed to using in order to maintain its hegemony in politics, economics, and other areas. In this context, I note that the indefinite restrictive regime of the UN Security Council regarding the DPRK, inspired by the United States and its allies, must be reviewed. The propaganda cliches reproduced over and over again by Westerners are no longer able to disguise their aggressive geopolitical plans, including in the Northeast Asia region. Our assessments regarding the root causes of the escalation of military political tensions coincide. This is a confrontational US policy to expand its military infrastructure in the sub-region, which is accompanied by a significant increase in the scale and intensity of various military exercises, with the participation of the Republic of Korea and Japan, which are hostile to the DPRK. Such steps undermine peace and stability in the peninsula and pose a security threat to all countries of Northeast Asia. We categorically reject attempts to blame the Democratic People's Republic of Korea for the deterioration of the situation. Pyongyang has the right to take reasonable measures to strengthen its own defense capabilities, ensure national security, and protect sovereignty. So, interesting points raised by Putin there. Again, not something that I don't think he's been that open about it before. It's a more definitive statement of Russian policy. The Russians are already working around and have opted out of essentially the UN sanctions regime. We can expect them to veto it next time it comes up for a vote. I suspect they'll do the vetoing. The Chinese will do the abstaining. Again, the Chinese are engaged in their own battles with the Americans, which makes their partnership with the Russians even more vital for them. So the Russians will block the next set of sanctions, and the sanctions will fall apart, which means then that the Russians will be, and the Chinese will then be even more free to trade out in the open with the DPRK. So it certainly seems like that there is a ongoing military relationship between the DPRK and the Russian Federation. Now, there's been allegations, of course, that the DPRK has been supplying shells to Russia for the special military operation and ballistic missiles, to which I can only say, if it's true, based. If it's not true, then it should be true. I don't see how this discredits the Russians, that they are able to draw upon the resources of what is said, even by the enemies of the DPRK, to be a very extensive and very efficient military, technological and scientific base of production that they have. So if it's true, then I say good. And it's obviously going to be positive for the DPRK in terms of the agreement that's been signed that will enable them to further update areas that they've not been able to fully update just by the usage of their own resources, particularly their air force and, of course, their navy capabilities, their naval capabilities. Though, of course, they have produced their own submarine now, but I imagine that they will be able to produce nuclear-powered submarines pretty quickly with the assistance of the Russians, who lead the world in that particular field of technology. So, moving on then to look at some highlights from the Treaty on Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, as it's called. I get this from KCNA, which is the DPRK's official media outlet. Now, there's a lot of interesting material in there. I will highlight the military aspect, though I'm going to republish the whole thing on the website, on the Marx Engels Lenin Institute website. So you can all take a look at it on there. A lot of it is standard stuff about development of trade relations, developing free economic zones in both countries, and further building relationships on the cultural, the educational, and the tourist side of things. But the one thing I wanted to emphasize now was that it is, of course, a joint defense treaty. So the wording here is quite explicit, and in terms of the what it commits the two sides to. So I'll just read here from the section that deals with the Defense Pact. So this reads as follows. In case a direct threat of armed invasion is created against any one of the two states, the two sides shall immediately operate the channel of bilateral negotiations for the purpose of adjusting their stands at the request of any one side, and discussing feasible practical measures to ensure mutual assistance for removing the prevailing threat. In case any one of the two sides is put in a state of war by an armed invasion from an individual state or several states, the other side shall provide military and other assistance with all means in its possession without delay, in accordance with Article 51 of the UN Charter and the laws of the DPRK and the Russian Federation. So that's as unequivocal as you can get. If the US tries something with regard to Korea, I don't think they'd try it themselves. I think they'd get the South Korean puppets to do it, or they'd get the Japanese puppets to do it. Then it triggers an immediate clause in this treaty which will allow the Russians to mobilize their armed forces in defense of the DPRK. And that's as explicit as you get in diplomatic language. In fact, it's rather blunt. So this is the checkmate move, if one hadn't been made already, on the Korean Peninsula. This is the end of any hope that the US could conceivably have had of launching some kind of military operation against the DPRK. Now, I think that they never really were in with much of a chance, because I think if they'd have tried it, they would have got badly mangled in the process of doing so. There's arguments to say that the certain aspects of the Korean puppet regime militarily are stronger. So, for instance, the puppet regime's air force apparently is stronger, but there would never really be much of a chance of doing some sort of ground invasion, not without it going disastrously wrong. But any hope that they had of doing anything on this, with regard to this, has now decisively gone out of the window. The Chinese might have had a quiet agreement with the DPRK about joint defense, which I think that would always have been honored. But this is a very explicit, out in the open agreement to defend, for the DPRK and the Russian Federation to defend each other. So this is now a very explicit, specific military alliance that they're in, that is equally as strong as what they had in the period of the existence of the Soviet Union, perhaps even a little bit stronger. So very interesting development. It basically means that the US has no hope of doing some kind of external intervention, and due to the strength of the dictatorship of the proletariat in the DPRK, they stand very little chance of doing some kind of internal coup there. In fact, they've had various characters over the years who have degenerated to the point of becoming pro-US, and they've been swiftly dealt with, and rightly so, inside the DPRK's system. So this is all very incredibly interesting developments, very crucial to understand, and there's a lot more to study coming out of this. And I think it's only going to be to the benefit of the DPRK, but also to the benefit of progressive forces, particularly the KPRF in Russia, because as Putin has, of course, no doubt observed, the most reliable friends that the Russian Federation have are those who are socialist or left nationalist-led countries now. And the fantasies about the based Europeans are now biting the dust, thankfully. So, been talking for 45 minutes. So we will now point ourselves towards the questions and start looking at these. Right, where are we? So we will do the greetings in the chat first. So I'm going to have to take a sip of the tea because this is England. Dr. Ahmed is with us from Egypt. Good afternoon to you. Paul Mason is with us. I'm sure Paul Mason is hating all this talk of Stalinism. How's the campaign going, Paul? You seem to be clinging on to, well, barely clinging on to any shred of sanity. I am having Kit Clarenberg back on the show pretty soon, so I'm sure if you're watching then, that will push you over the edge for good. Banana Bender, good evening to you. Svetlana joins us from stormy Moscow. Grassy Nolla is joining us from Seattle, Washington. And Luca joins us, who says, friendly greetings from Perfidious Albion. I was watching some mainstream media coverage of Putin's trip to the DPRK yesterday. Pathetic would be an understatement. Yeah, it's, I mean, Putin said it himself, which is like the propaganda is ridiculous about the DPRK. And he knows that now because the propaganda about him has got as ridiculous as the propaganda about the DPRK. It would probably be worth us doing an hour just on propaganda narratives, but like once you start reading seriously and you speak to people who've been to the DPRK, you realize just not only is it everything you hear a lie, but it's a lie that's so obviously wrong and so obvious and easily disproved. You wonder how you ever fell for it in the first place. I blame Trotskyism myself. I also blame George Orwell. May that rat burn in hell for all eternity. Svetlana says, I'm going to try and read the Cyrillic now. Privyet dobre den. I hope I got that right. James Graham is with us, as is Kalmo, as is Anti-Natzo. Anti-Natzo says, Western media is coping hard about Putin's visit to Korea and Vietnam. They're trying to say Putin is begging for weapons. No, that's Zelensky. Yeah, I mean, he's not begging for weapons. The Russians have got more than enough of their own. I mean, if they have been supplied with 5 million shells from the DPRK, then, well, that should give the West pause for thought, shouldn't it? And again, if Russia has an ally which is capable of producing that much military material, then really the West should be telling Zelensky to just give up and go home. Though the South Korean puppet regime is now apparently going to double down. And apparently they're going to invite Zelensky to Seoul, so he can presumably snort his way around all the most promising cocaine spots and probably star in an anime or two. I'm not sure. Comrade Terry, good afternoon to you. S.W. Haster is with us. Svetlana says, today's Pravda says the Germans are about to start building an armaments factory in Lithuania. Well, the Germans always are on the lookout for slave labor. The good news is that imports of German beer into Russia are up 17%. So much for sanctions. Sanctions are good, but money is better. And that is the motto of all capitalists everywhere. S.W. Haster says, Putin is already in Vietnam, full red carpet treatment. Yes, he is indeed. I mean, I didn't dwell too much on the Vietnamese visit because it's not as dramatic, given that the Russian Federation has had a much more extensive economic relationship with Vietnam. What's notable about the Vietnam trip is basically that the Vietnamese are essentially saying to the US and anybody else who cares to listen, like the idiots that run Australia, well, we're going to have relationships with whoever we want. And I noticed on the Vietnamese government's website, they were talking about a comprehensive partnership with Australia recently that's been signed. So they're essentially saying to the US and its puppet regimes like the Australian, the wretched Albanese regime, that, well, we're prepared to have partnerships with you, but you don't get to tell us who we have partnerships with. And we're not going to tell you who we do have them with either. And this is, of course, reminiscent of the line taken by the Chinese and by the Russians themselves, that they aren't going to dictate to anybody who they should have relations with. And nobody gets to dictate to them who they have relations with. Now, that sounds quite basic in terms of a principle and something that anybody can get on board with. The problem for the US, of course, is that their entire business model is based upon that. Telling people, no, you can't have any relations with them because you have to be locked into agreements with us that keep you servile. That's basically the US position. Lachlan, good afternoon to you, and also good afternoon to Albert. Jawad is with us. Good to have you here. Steve Choate says, to quote the not-so-great US capitalist politician Hubert Humphrey, I am as pleased as punch to be here. Greetings, comrades, from Georgia, USA. And good to have you with us from Georgia, USA. I hope the weather is treating you well. I'm told that Georgia is something of a sweaty place at the best of times. I've never been there myself, but it's good to have you with us. Lachlan asks, how many times have you read Capital, and what other literature would you recommend on understanding capitalism, how it has developed? I read Capital Volume 1. I'm on going through my fourth read-through of that, and I think I'm only just beginning to properly understand it, to be honest. I've read 2 and 3 once each time. I've read Grundrisse once, but that was, when was that? 23 years ago, and I've not looked at it since. The other project I have on, which is paused at the moment, is reading through the 4th volume of Capital, the notebooks. So I would, of course, recommend all of those. But in terms of understanding capitalism and its development, well, I would respond to Lachlan's request by posting a link to the CPGBML education program. You can find an awful lot on there about the development of capitalism. And so I'd recommend reading through that. Banana Bender says, long live Duce, and Banana Bender is right. Otis is with us, as is Gonzalo, as is Not a Pacifist, as is Slavo. Good afternoon to you, comrade. Apparently the Russian media weren't talking about Putin's visit to Pyongyang. That's interesting. It's all over the front page of the Russian government's website. I do wonder, are you talking about Gazeta Pravda, the KPRF publication, Svetlana, if you can confirm? I know the KPRF made a rather interesting, sarcastic comment that Putin's going to Marxist-Leninist countries. Is he gonna tell them about his favorite philosopher's view on Marxism-Leninism? I doubt that he is. Suicide rate in South Korea is also the second highest or highest in the world. Yeah, it's a nightmare place. I mean, I don't know the precise reason, but I think it might be part of the reason why the DPRK just essentially gave up the route to try and peaceful reunification. I mean, it was speculated upon by Kim Il-sung in the 70s that the US was seeking to make the South Koreans into a different people that it would be impossible to reunify with. Now, I mean, I don't know the exact situation, but I know there's a lot of degeneracy and madness in the South, but that can be cured by going through a revolutionary process. And I'm convinced that in the end, there will be a revolution in South Korea that will lead to the reunification of the Korean Peninsula on a socialist basis. And in the end, we will see Kim Il-sung's vision realized. And it'll be the North, which is the template, not the South. But the South, of course, has a high level of industrial capacity. So the people who really don't want to see reunification on any basis are, of course, the Japanese militarists and the US imperialists, because a unified socialist Korea under a dictatorship of the proletariat, imagine how powerful that could potentially be. Apparently, Lord Amherst was sent by the British East India Company to Korea in 1832, but that plan was abandoned. Well, I would say the Koreans got off lightly, but they got the Japanese imperialists who were every bit as brutal. Greetings to Christopher Rogers, who joins us from the Hong Kong region in the People's Republic of China. Anti-Natso is throwing up about K-pop, and that is completely correct. There is only one good version of Korean music, and that is the versions that come from the north. Tim Gray joins us from the greenhouse, or building a greenhouse. Glad to keep you company on your travails in manual labor. S.W. Haster says, I believe the US has been at war with the rest of the world, especially against the developing world, to make them stay underdeveloped. It's not just the US. I mean, that's Britain, that's France, that's Germany, that's everybody. Key part of imperialism is to make sure that the poor countries in the world stay poor and they stay underdeveloped. And that's as true as for the US as it is for the British. They don't want countries to develop. It's part of the reason they hate the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative so much, is that unlike the imperialist powers, the Chinese are actually encouraging more all-around development of the countries they do business with. Whereas the imperialists will only ever build things that enable them to engage in extraction purposes or for purposes of domination and control. Chinese are promoting a more comprehensive approach. DPRK has been under US sanctions since the Korean War. Yes, that's correct. Brad Wall joins us. John Jones joins us from Cardiff, who says, you gave a good account of Reform Party last time, but Galloway was conspicuous by his absence. I've finished watching the programme. Is Galloway a blip the media can ignore? I didn't talk about Galloway because I've already talked about him on previous programmes, and we were mainly focusing on, I mean, I found it more useful in that programme that I did yesterday to focus just on the lies in the Labour Party manifesto. And there was so many just in one section that it took us a while to go through. I haven't covered the Galloway launch because I haven't read the Workers' Party manifesto for the general election as yet. When I do, I will highlight it. I mean, just to say though, the media shouldn't be ignoring Galloway because he's a sitting MP, and he's a sitting MP who's been elected as an MP far more times, well, more times than Farage ever has, and with a better track record of winning elections than Farage has. Reform are being promoted specifically because they are a reactionary party that is principally coming from the lower end of the bourgeoisie and the upper end of the petty bourgeoisie. They will pick up working class votes as well, though. I think they'll perform about as well as UKIP did in 2015, which is they may get as many as 4 to 4.5 million votes, possibly a bit higher. But the bigger problem for Galloway and the WPV isn't media blackout, which is happening. It's that they didn't have time enough to build themselves up organisations in the key constituencies that would enable them to overcome the media blackout and the relentless propaganda promoting Reform and Farage as the oppositional choice. That's the problem to get over. I don't think that I think Galloway overstated Farage a little bit in his launch that I watched yesterday. I think Farage will do about as well as he did 10 years ago. I think any party led by him and defined by him has a natural ceiling at the moment. As I say, the bigger thing for reform is that if the Conservatives do get an absolute battering, then you may end up with what is left of the Conservative and Unionist Party and Reform coming together to form something new. A big ruling class wish is for a political realignment to revive legitimacy for the system, but we'll have to see if the results allow them to do that. Albert says Putin took his time to discover the bleeding obvious. Well, that's true, but bear in mind it's never just about Putin. It's about this Russian system as a whole. McGregor said that the global world order is Marxist. Yeah, well, he says a lot of things which are bullshit, but I think on the question of Russian tech being passed to the DPRK with regard to nuclear missiles, some Russian tech getting to the DPRK, I think he was right about that. I think he's wrong about just about everything else, just to be clear. Zain Mudassir says, the far right in Italy immediately showed loyalty to the US. Of course they did. They always do. This idea that there's based Euro or British nationalists who are going to say no to the US is complete bullshit. All these people are committed to imperialism. And so if they are committed to imperialism, they have to be committed to maintaining the relationship which enables the imperialism. And that relationship is with the US. The US, which of course is constantly trying to scalp the imperialist powers and steal their market share. But again, without the US assistance, they don't get to keep even the market share that the US allows them. You see how they're stuck? And the right wing, because they're based on the bourgeois and because they're based on, to a certain extent, also on the petty bourgeois, that's not something which is going to be able to lead an anti-imperialist movement. It's just something which is going to fall into line because that's the nature of the class forces that are behind it. And Meloni's proved that. Le Pen will prove that as well in France. AfD will prove it as well in Germany. And hopefully then the fantasies that some have involving these organizations will dissipate. Jawad says, so decadent and degenerate is the monopoly imperialist capitalist system that the only way one can find inspiration is through drugs and so-called holy psychedelics. Well, that's why they're promoting drug use these days. If you're high, you're not noticing things. Spurious Furious is with us. Good to have you with us. Morgan says, excellent point regarding the realization in Moscow of where the bulk of their international support is coming from or likely to come from. Yeah, it took them a while to get there, but there is a slow realization. James Goblin joins us from Belgrade, Yugoslavia. The real Paul Mason is apparently giving Labour good advice on X. Well, good stuff. And yes, be sure to like and share the stream if you have not done so already. Svetlana asks, is there a book or long essay about the DPRK that is not that is objective and not Western bourgeois propaganda? No. In terms of objective studies of the DPRK, there aren't any. There's some useful information that comes from the DPRK itself. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scroll through here and just find you the right link, because there are a couple of places you can find material on the DPRK. So there's this here, which I'm going to post in the chat. If you'll just bear with me a moment, which is to do with that's official publications from the DPRK. So that's always useful to look through. And then there's this, which is it's an Indian Maoist site, which has a very strange view of the DPRK. But they do have a lot of archived material, including the collected works of Kim Il-sung on there. So if you go through those, there's the official material from the DPRK will at least enable you to understand the system from the perspective of those who live there and, of course, practice the system. Matthew joins us from a hot and humid Massachusetts. Volume 3 of Capital is a must, says George Seiss, and George is correct. Morgan says, China are making friendly relations with Australia unthinkable. in 2022, and even through most of 23 that they would drop visa requirements for Australian tourists. Well, the Chinese are determined to try and hang on to the relationships they have. I mean, it makes no sense for Australia to be in a hostile confrontation with the Chinese. They've so much of their economic growth in the 2000s was down to the trading relationship with China. So why give that up? Because what? Because dribbling old Joe Biden demands it, or because Donald Trump demands it? I mean, it just shows the lack of independence, the lack of sovereignty, and the colonized nature of Australia. Like its independence process was truncated, to say the least. It's ended up in a position where it is no longer directly influenced as much by British imperialism, but US imperialism has taken over. It doesn't have sovereignty. Australia is not an independent country. Neither is New Zealand either, by the way. Neither is Canada. I mean, these are neo-colonial states who, after World War II, distanced themselves from the old colonial master in Britain, but just found a new neo-colonial master in the form of the United States. None of these countries are independent. I emphasize that again. When the US cracks the whip, all of them stand to attention and deliver themselves for a beating. So yeah, the Chinese are going to keep trying to keep Australia on side, but it's just not going to happen. Barring a revolution in Australia which overturns the current system and removes the relationship with US imperialism and chucks out US imperialism from the country, which I can't see happening anytime soon. If Australians know different, please do correct me. Then Australia is going to get dragged into whatever insane plan that the US imperialists have to try and derail Chinese development. CE joins us from Midsummer, Sweden. The media here is going apeshit over Putin's visit to the DPRK. Good. Because the more they go apeshit, the better. I mean, it shows their weakness. Otis says DPRK has done many brilliant things despite starving. Yeah, they're starving and also launching satellites into space. I mean, there were problems with food supply in the 1990s and the early 2000s, I think. It's never reached the point of that everybody was dying in the street or something. You know, like people did when the British starved Indians to death in the 1940s. But it was difficult. But the Korean people came through it because, again, it comes down to the strength of the proletarian dictatorship, the role of the masses in the governing of society, the masses feeling and knowing and understanding their role in the system, and that the system belongs to them. That is why people's Korea survived. Good morning to Todd, who joins us from New Mexico. Richard says some fascists are honest on Twitter when they say that Africa deserves to be plundered. Yeah, some of them are. Some of them pretend that they're opposed to the. Some of them pretend that they're opposed to the US as well, but they're not. They're fascists, are sad little bitches, basically. And Hitler was a loser and a cuck who continued to pay the debts of the Weimar Germany that he apparently hated so much. Continued to pay debts owed to US banks even when US bombers were dropping high explosive devices on German cities. So Hitler, cuck, fraud, loser, pathetic arsehole. Fascists, sad losers who have to cover up the fact that they are craven servants of big capital by engaging in like romanticist hysteria about concepts of the nation that are completely divorced from material reality. They are fantasists, and they have to be delusional fantasists to believe that craven submission to capital is, based and manly behavior. It's garbage. Everything they believe in is garbage, and it always has been, going all the way back to Mussolini, who was a paid servant of the British and the French, by the way, and sacrificed his own country and hundreds of thousands of Italians in order to, first of all, try and serve the interests of Britain and France, then serve the interests of Germany. So, fuck them all. They are the most pathetic weaklings dressed up as phony hard men. Do I think the US system is heading for collapse? You know what, Richard? I'm going to avoid the giving you an easy answer on that one because I don't know at this stage. I hope not. I hope that the US proletariat can get itself or can become organized enough to overcome the current problems and to overcome the current problems being the continued rule of the US ruling class. In terms of a collapse, I'm not going to speculate on it because I need to go back and I'm going to quote Lenin and say I need to go back and consult Marx and Engels more and Lenin himself and consult Hegel more before I can give you a coherent answer to that question. I'm answering you in that way because I think there's too much wishful thinking about this. But the US is just going to overturn itself. Bear in mind, the Soviet Union got overturned because a comprador element seized power in a coup and was able to carry through a counter-revolution. There's not the equivalent process going on in the United States. So there's no element in the ruling class there which is going to seize power and collapse the system or something. So I am resistant to the idea that it will collapse on its own. So what I will do is I will go away and read more and come back to you on that question, Richard. Well, apparently Richard Wolff has various opinions on the future of the US. And well, it seems to depend upon who he's speaking to and what day it is as to which opinion he has, Richard, to be honest. Jan Zizka says, the state of the American proletariat regarding class consciousness is grim. We're trying, but everyone is so cynical and idealistic and afraid of change. Well, I will have to investigate that further. Investigating into the state of class consciousness inside the imperial core. There you go. That's an interesting program for us to do in the near future. James Goblin says, when talking to my Westoid friends, I like calling DPRK just Korea. Which one? The Democratic People's Republic of Korea, of course. You can usually imagine how it ends. Yeah, well, you got to normalize these things, haven't you? Okay. Right, it is 3:15. So I'm going to draw the stream to a close for today. I hope that you can join me again tomorrow when we're going to be checking in on African affairs. There's a lot of stories coming out of both Western, Eastern and Southern Africa at the moment, which are very much worthy of attention. So I'm going to be doing a special on that tomorrow. And on Saturday, we will have the next in the Stalin series. So please join me for that. Until tomorrow, though, I'll thank all of you for tuning in. Thanks to everybody who supports the program on Patreon. The audio versions of these latest programs will be up there later today. And if you want to support the program, you can take out a subscription on the Patreon page. You go to the Buy Me a Coffee link. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I'll be back with you again tomorrow.
До края, южный гор до северных морей. Человек проходит, как хозяин, необъятной родины своей. Тут жизнь невольна и широка, точно Волга полная течет. Молодым везде у нас дорога, старикам везде у нас почет. За столом никто у нас не лишний, по заслугам каждый награжден. Золотыми буквами буквами мы пишем всенародный сталинский закон. Этих слов величие и слав никакие годы не сотрут. Человек всегда имеет право на учение, отдых и на труд.